He expected a black-edged letter, a notice of quiet expiry delivered by a slow-moving country solicitor. He had, after all, purchased a dying woman and interred her in a crumbling tomb of an estate, a transaction as neat and cold as a line item in a ledger. He did not expect, 2 years later, to return to that tomb, seeking his own quiet and only to find it fiercely, stubbornly alive. He did not expect to find the ghost he had abandoned ruling a small, muddy, defiant kingdom. And he certainly did not expect that in the heart of that reclamation, he would find not a grave, but the only home he had ever known. The solicitor's office smelled of dust and decaying paper, a scent that Alastair, the Duke of Rexmoor, associated with the final, dreary administration of death. He stood by the tall, grimy window, his gaze fixed on the London street below, a river of gray coats and gray faces flowing beneath a perpetually gray sky. The city was a machine he knew how to operate, a complex web of influence, debt, and power that he manipulated with the same detached precision he had once used to direct cannon fire. This meeting was a minor, irritating cog in that machine, a nuisance to be dealt with before he returned to the far more pressing matter of dismantling a rival's shipping interests. He did not look at the other occupants of the room. He was aware of them as presences, a blot of cloying desperation and cheap perfume emanating from a man, and a pocket of still, cold air from the girl. Lord Vance, a baron whose lineage was far older than his credit, was sweating. Alastair could hear the man's shallow, wheezing breaths, the frantic rustle of his waistcoat as he shifted in his chair. The man owed him a fortune, a sum lost over cards and disastrous speculations. Debts Alastair had quietly acquired for precisely this purpose. "Your Grace," the solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, began, his voice dry as the documents laid out on his desk. "If we might review the terms. The entirety of Lord Vance's debts, principal and interest, to be forgiven by your hand." Alastair gave a short, sharp nod, his eyes still on the street. A carriage horse had slipped on the slick cobblestones, its struggle a brief, ugly piece of theater before its master hauled it back to its feet. An inconvenience, quickly forgotten. In exchange, Pembroke continued, his tone dropping to one of clinical delicacy. "Lord Vance offers the hand of his ward and niece, Miss Illara Vance, in marriage." Silence descended, thick and suffocating. It was broken by a small, dry cough from the corner where the girl sat. It was not a dramatic, consumptive sound, but something small and persistent, the noise of a delicate instrument slowly falling out of tune. Alastair finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over her for the first time. She was exactly as advertised, pale, slender to the point of seeming brittle, with a frame that looked as if a strong gust of wind might snap it in two. Her dress was clean but worn, the dark gray wool a testament to her poverty. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her head bowed just enough to be proper, but not enough to be truly demure. He noted, with a clinical detachment, the faint blue veins at her temples and the almost translucent quality of her skin. The physicians he had consulted, based on third-hand reports from her uncle, had been clear: a weak constitution, a history of lung ailments, a constitution ill-suited to childbearing or, indeed, longevity. She was perfect. His title, his vast fortune, came with a single, archaic stipulation from a long-dead grandfather with a puritanical streak. The Duke must be married by his 35th birthday to inherit the last and most significant of the Rexmoor properties. Alastair had 4 months. He had no time for a London season, no patience for the simpering debutantes and their ambitious mothers. He needed a wife who would not interfere, would not make demands, would not, under any circumstances, require his attention. A sickly orphan with no connections, one who could be installed in a remote, forgotten corner of his holdings and left to quietly fade, was the ideal solution. It was brutal, but war had burned any sentimentality out of him long ago. He dealt in solutions, not emotions. "The arrangement is acceptable," Alastair said, his voice low and resonant, cutting through the stale air. Lord Vance let out a breath that was half sob, half gasp of relief. Your Grace, you are most generous. Most generous. Elara, my dear, thanked the Duke. For the first time, the girl lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Alistair had been expecting fear, or perhaps the cowed gratitude of a rescued pauper. He saw neither. Her eyes were a startling, lucid gray, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They were not vacant. They were intelligent, watchful, and held a profound, unnerving cynicism that seemed far too old for her face. There was a flicker of something in their depths, defiance, perhaps, or sheer, unadulterated contempt. She did not thank him. Her gaze held his for a moment longer than was proper, a silent challenge that was as impertinent as it was unexpected. Then, she inclined her head, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. It was not an act of gratitude. It was an acknowledgment of a transaction concluded. Alistair felt a sliver of irritation. He had expected a pawn, a fragile piece to be moved and forgotten. The look in her eyes suggested she knew the rules of the game, even if she had no power to change the outcome. The ceremony will take place tomorrow at dawn, he stated, turning his attention back to the solicitor, in the chapel of my London residence. A special license has been procured. You, he said, his gaze flicking to Lord Vance, will not be present. Your debt is settled. Our business is concluded. The Baron paled, then reddened, sputtering. But my own niece's wedding. You have sold her, Alistair said, his voice flat and cold. You are no longer entitled to the merchandise. The bluntness of the statement hung in the air like the smoke from a just-fired pistol. Lord Vance shrank back in his chair, his brief moment of relief curdling into humiliation. Elara, however, did not flinch. Her expression did not change, but Alistair saw a muscle tighten in her jaw. She had heard the words. She had absorbed them, and she had already known them to be true. Miss Vance will be escorted to Rexmoor House this afternoon, Alistair continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. Pembroke, see to the final signatures. He turned and walked out of the office without a backward glance, the scent of dust and desperation already fading from his memory. He had a duchy to run, enemies to crush, and a fortune to command. He had just acquired a duchess, a temporary, disposable duchess. The matter was closed. The journey to Blackwood Manor was a study in gray misery. It began the morning after the wedding, a ceremony so brief and cold it felt more like the reading of a will. They stood in the Duke's private chapel, a cavernous, unused space that amplified the chill. Alistair had spoken his vows in a monotone, his mind already on a dispatch from the Admiralty that awaited him on his desk. Alara's responses had been whispers, lost in the echoing void. There were no flowers, no guests, no pretense of celebration. He had placed a plain gold band on her finger, the metal cold against her skin, and then he had turned and led the way out. Now, they sat opposite each other in the funereal black of his carriage, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof a constant, dreary companion. For 2 days, they traveled north, the lush greens of the southern counties giving way to the stark, brooding landscapes of the borderlands. The roads worsened, the carriage wheels sinking in a mud that seemed determined to suck them down into the earth. Inside, the silence was as thick and heavy as the fog that pressed against the windows. Alistair did not speak to her. He read. He sat, ramrod straight, a sheaf of documents in his hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not seem to notice her presence at all. He was a portrait of handsome, glacial indifference, a strong jaw, a straight nose, eyes the color of chips of ice. He was a man carved from duty and discipline, and she was nothing more than a footnote in the text of his life. Elara watched him for a time, her own quiet study. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers, long and elegant, would tighten on the papers as if wringing the life from them. She saw the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a relic, she supposed, from the war that had made his name and, by all accounts, hollowed out his soul. He was not a man. He was a title, a force, and she was an inconvenience he had been forced to accommodate. She turned her gaze to the window, watching the world dissolve into a watercolor wash of brown and gray. She had spent her life as an unwanted parcel, passed from one reluctant relative to another after her parents' death. Her uncle had been the last and the worst, a man who saw her not as a burden, but as an asset to be liquidated. She had always known this day would come. She had imagined it 100 times, a portly merchant, a gout-ridden squire. She had never, in her most morbid imaginings, pictured a duke. But the outcome was the same. She was being disposed of. The only difference was the grandeur of the setting. This duke, with his cold eyes and his colder heart, was not offering her a life. He was offering her a place to die. He had bought her for her weakness, for the cough that now rattled in her chest, exacerbated by the ceaseless damp. He was banishing her to some forgotten corner of his empire, and the name of her prison was Blackwood. On the evening of the third day, the carriage lurched to a halt. The rain had intensified, lashing against the glass. The coachman opened the door, and a blast of cold, wet air filled the small space, carrying with it the scent of rot and sodden earth. "We are here, Your Grace," the coachman said, his voice muffled by the wind. Alistair folded his papers with crisp, final movements. He did not look at her. He stepped out of the carriage, his tall frame a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. Alara gathered her worn cloak around her and followed, her thin shoes sinking immediately into the thick, grasping mud of the driveway. And she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was not a house. It was a carcass. A great, skeletal beast of dark stone slumped against a barren hillside, its roof sagging like a broken spine. Countless windows stared out like vacant eyes, many of them boarded over, others shattered. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the walls, a choking green shroud that seemed to be actively pulling the stones apart. The gardens were a riot of weeds and thorns, a twisted, dead maze. The place did not just look neglected, it looked malevolent. It radiated a profound and ancient misery. It was a tomb, his tomb for her. Alistair stood for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the decaying facade. There was no flicker of dismay or surprise on his face. This was what he had expected. This was what he had chosen. The main door creaked open, spilling a weak, yellow sliver of light into the gloom. A woman stood there, gaunt and severe, holding a single, sputtering candle. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. "Mrs. Croft," Alistair acknowledged. He turned, his eyes finally landing on Alara, who stood shivering in the rain, mud clinging to the hem of her dress. His expression was one of pure, blank dismissal. He was looking at a problem he was about to solve. "This is the Duchess," he said, the title sounding like a mockery in this place. "She is unwell. See that she is made comfortable. A quiet room in the south wing. She is not to be disturbed, and she is not to disturb me." The finality of the statement was absolute. He was not introducing a wife. He was delivering a package. He looked at her one last time. There was no pity, no kindness, not even a flicker of human connection. There was only the cold, hard finality of a command. "Do not write to me. Do not make requests. My business here is finished." He did not say, "Die quietly," but the words hung in the air between them, as tangible as the cold rain that soaked her to the bone. Without another word, he turned, climbed back into the waiting carriage, and shut the door. He did not look back. Alara stood frozen in the mud and the downpour, watching as the carriage executed a clumsy turn in the ruined driveway and rumbled away, its lamps shrinking into the darkness until they were swallowed completely. She was alone, left on the doorstep of her own grave, with the wind howling around the skeletal remains of Blackwood Manor and the cold seeping deep into her bones. The gaunt housekeeper, Mrs. Croft, watched her from the doorway, her expression a mixture of contempt and grim satisfaction. She was looking at the new mistress of the house, and all she saw was another body to be buried. The room they gave her was a perfect, self-contained universe of cold. It was in the south wing, as the Duke had commanded, a vast, cavernous chamber with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadows. A threadbare carpet, the color of dried blood, failed to hide the dark stains on the floorboards. The furniture, a towering wardrobe, a warped dressing table, and a monstrous four-poster bed, loomed like ancient monoliths in the gloom. A single window, its glass streaked with grime, looked out onto a landscape of unending rain and skeletal trees. But the defining feature of the room was the damp. It was in the very air she breathed, a palpable presence that clung to the velvet curtains, which smelled of mildew and dust and beaded on the cold stone of the fireplace, where no fire had been lit in a generation. Her first few weeks at Blackwood were a blur of shivering misery. Mrs. Croft, the housekeeper, ruled the decaying manor with a rod of iron and a heart of granite. She was a woman who had long ago made her peace with decay, and she viewed Alara not as her new mistress, but as the final, twitching symptom of a terminal illness. She and the two skeletal maids who constituted the entire indoor staff treated the new Duchess with a chillingly correct indifference. They brought her thin, watery gruel on a tray, changed the linen on her bed once a week, and otherwise left her entirely to her own devices. They were waiting for her to die. The cold and damp worked their way into Alara's lungs, and the slight, dry cough she had arrived with deepened into a rattling, body-racking affliction. She spent most of her days in the enormous, cold bed, buried under a mountain of musty blankets, feeling her strength seep away into the damp sheets. The house itself seemed to be actively trying to kill her. Drafts slithered under the door like icy serpents. The relentless drumming of the rain was a constant, maddening assault on her nerves. At night, she would lie awake, listening to the groan of the ancient timbers and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls, and feel as if the house were a great, rotting beast slowly digesting her. She was at her lowest ebb. The defiant spark she had clung to in the solicitor's office had been all but extinguished. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket, far more suffocating than the musty woolens piled on her bed. She was 20 years old, and her life was over. Her husband, the man who was legally bound to protect her, had thrown her away like so much trash. She would die here in this cold, wet, forgotten place, and no one in the world would even notice she was gone. Her name would be a footnote in the Rexmoor family history. Alara Vance, first wife of the 9th Duke, died without issue. A life distilled into a single, sterile line of text. One morning, she woke from a fitful, feverish sleep to a world of gray light. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was still thick with moisture. A fit of coughing seized her, a brutal, tearing thing that left her gasping for breath, her head spinning. When it passed, she lay panting against the pillows, feeling the familiar, weary ache in her chest. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the tarnished silver of a hand mirror left on the bedside table. The face that stared back was a stranger's. It was the face of a ghost. Her skin was waxy and pale, her eyes huge and shadowed in a face that had grown gaunt and sharp. Her hair was a lank, lifeless mess. She looked like the dying woman everyone expected her to be. And in that moment, something shifted. It was not a wave of hope. It was a surge of pure, white-hot fury. A cold, hard, clarifying rage that burned through the fog of her despair. She thought of the Duke's dismissive, cruel face. She thought of her uncle's greedy, pathetic relief. She thought of Mrs. Croft's smug, knowing glances. They had all written her off. They had all dug her grave and were simply waiting for her to have the good grace to lie down in it. No, the word was not spoken. It was a silent, violent rebellion in the core of her being. She would not die to make their lives more convenient. She would not fade away quietly in this damp, miserable room. If she was going to die, she would die on her own terms. And if she was going to live, she would start right now. With a groan of effort, she pushed herself up. Her limbs felt heavy, her muscles atrophied, but she swung her legs over the side of the bed and planted her bare feet on the icy floorboards. The shock of the cold was galvanizing. She stood, swaying slightly, her thin nightdress doing nothing to ward off the chill. She took a breath. then another. She walked out of the bedroom. The hallway was a long, dark tunnel of peeling wallpaper and shadowed doorways. She made her way, one hand on the wall for support, towards a main staircase. The house was silent, but it was a waiting silence. She descended the grand, creaking stairs, her bare feet making soft padding sounds on the dusty wood. She found Mrs. Croft in what had once been a morning room, now a storage space for shrouded furniture. The housekeeper was counting linens, her lips a thin, disapproving line. She looked up as Alara entered, her eyes widening in genuine shock. It was the first time she had seen the Duchess out of her room. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight with surprise and a hint of accusation, as if Alara were breaking some unspoken rule. "You should be in bed." Alara met the older woman's gaze. Her own voice was weak, raspy from coughing and disuse, but she infused it with every ounce of steel she possessed. "Mrs. Croft," she said, "you will have my things moved out of the south wing immediately." The housekeeper's jaw tightened. The Duke was most specific. "The Duke," Alara cut in, her voice gaining a surprising amount of strength, "is in London. I am here. This house is trying to kill me, and I have decided not to let it." She took another breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "There must be a servant's room, somewhere near the kitchens. One that is small and dry. You will move my bed there." Mrs. Croft stared at her, dumbfounded. The sheer, practical audacity of the command was something she had not anticipated. A duchess demanding to be moved into a servant's quarters? It was unthinkable. It was madness. And Alara continued, pressing her advantage. "You will light a fire in the kitchen hearth. A large one, and you will keep it lit day and night. If I'm to get well, I need warmth. If you have forgotten how to provide it, I will learn to do it myself." She held the housekeeper's gaze, a silent battle of wills fought in the dusty, gray light. "Am I understood?" For a long, tense moment, the housekeeper said nothing. She saw not the frail, dying girl she had dismissed, but a woman with eyes like chips of flint and a spine forged from something far stronger than flesh and bone. Mrs. Croft had served the Rexmoor family for 40 years, had watched this house crumble around her, had bowed to a long line of masters. But this was something new. This was not an aristocrat giving a lofty order. This was a survivor issuing a command for survival. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Croft gave a stiff, reluctant nod. "Yes, Your Grace." It was the first battle, and Alara had won. She had stopped acting like a dying woman and had started acting like a living one. And in the cold, decaying heart of Blackwood Manor, a revolution had just begun. The move to the small, whitewashed room behind the kitchens was a tactical retreat that felt like a monumental victory. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a small chest, and a single chair, but it was warm and blessedly dry. It shared a wall with the massive kitchen chimney, and a pleasant, steady heat radiated from the stones, a constant, comforting presence. For the first time in months, Alara slept through the night without shivering, the deep, rattling cough in her chest beginning to loosen its grip. The air she breathed no longer tasted of mildew and defeat. It tasted of wood smoke and, faintly, of hope. This small, warm space became her command center. From here, she launched her campaign to reclaim not just her own life, but the house that had been designated as her tomb. She did not think of herself as a duchess. The title was a bitter joke. She thought of herself as a castellan, the beleaguered commander of a fortress under siege, and her enemies were decay, neglect, and the crushing weight of insolvency. Her first order of business was to understand the scope of the disaster. She requested the estate ledgers. Mrs. Croft, now hovering in a state of perpetually startled obedience, retrieved them from the Duke's abandoned study. They were enormous, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with the elegant but neglectful script of a long line of indifferent stewards. The last entry was dated 3 years prior. The finances of Blackwood Manor had not simply been mismanaged. They had been utterly and completely abandoned. The estate was a ship adrift, its coffers empty, its income non-existent, its expenses a list of ghosts and memories. Alara spent a week poring over the books at the huge, sturdy kitchen table, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a mug of hot herbal tea always at her elbow. The maids, initially wary, began to watch her with a dawning curiosity. She was not the languid, demanding aristocrat they had been led to expect. She was quiet, focused, and her fingers were smudged with ink. She looked less like a duchess and more like a clerk, but there was an intensity about her that was more commanding than any noble title. The ledgers told a story of catastrophic waste. The estate still nominally employed a dozen ghost gardeners, a phantom stable master, and a retinue of servants who had either died or departed years ago. Taxes were in arrears. The home farm, once the jewel of the estate, was fallow, its tenants long gone, its cottages crumbling. Blackwood was not just decaying, it was actively hemorrhaging money it did not have into the void. Armed with this grim knowledge, Alara began to issue orders. They were not the grand pronouncements of a lady of the manor. They were the stark, practical commands of a quartermaster triage. "Mrs. Croft," she said one morning, pointing to a map of the house she had sketched on a piece of parchment. "We are closing the north and west wings. Completely. Board up the doors, the windows, everything. We cannot afford to heat them, we cannot afford to clean them, and we will not waste a single moment thinking about them. This house is no longer a manor. It is a four-room cottage with a great deal of useless storage space attached." The housekeeper, who had once been horrified by the idea of moving the Duchess to a servant's room, now merely nodded, her expression grim but accepting. She understood the logic of a strategic retreat. Next, Alara ventured outside. The air was crisp and cold, but felt clean in her lungs. She found a man Mrs. Croft had called Silas, the groundsman. He was a gnarled, weathered old man with hands like oak roots and a face that seemed to have been carved from the very stone of the manor. He was leaning on a spade, watching her approach with wary, pale blue eyes. He was the only remnant of the phantom army of gardeners, a lone soldier left on a long-abandoned battlefield. She did not ask him about rose gardens or ornamental follies. "Silas," she said, her breath pluming in the air, "I've been reading the old accounts. This estate once produced enough food to supply the house and sell at market. The soil in the kitchen garden, is it still viable?" The old man blinked, surprised by the question. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the weeds. "Soil's good. Just needs work. A lot of work. And the south-facing fields beyond the wall," she pressed. "The drainage is good there, according to the maps. Good for potatoes? Turnips? Things that will store through the winter." Silas straightened up, leaning less on his spade and more on his own 2 feet. He looked at her properly for the first time, seeing not a fragile doll, but a woman with a plan in her clear, gray eyes. "Aye," he said, a note of grudging respect in his voice. "Good for that. If a person had the seed, and the will to break the ground. I will find the money for the seed," Alara stated. "Do you have the will to help me?" A slow smile cracked the weathered landscape of his face. "Been waiting 20 years for someone to ask me that, Your Grace." He became her first and most loyal ally. Together, they were a small, determined army of 2. They did not try to reclaim the whole garden, just a single defensible patch. They dug, they weeded, they turned the soil. The work was hard, backbreaking. Alara's hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and stained with dirt. Her muscles ached, but with every weed she pulled, with every spadeful of earth she turned, she felt a little more of the phantom illness leaving her body, replaced by a deep, satisfying weariness and the strength of honest labor. To fund her burgeoning enterprise, she became a ruthless pragmatist. She identified assets that were useless to her survival. In a locked storeroom, she found a collection of hideous porcelain figurines and a set of tarnished silver plate for a banquet of 50. A banquet Blackwood would never host again. She had Silas crate them up. She wrote a brutally honest letter to a reputable dealer in York, a man mentioned in the ledgers from a more prosperous time. She did not ask for a duchess's price. She asked for a fair price, and quickly. The money, when it came, felt more valuable than all the Rexmoor jewels. She did not spend it on silks or comforts. She bought potato seed, turnip seed, hardy cabbages. She bought 3 laying hens and a cantankerous goat that Silas immediately christened Your Majesty. She paid a traveling tinker to patch the leaking roof over the kitchen and the library. Slowly, miraculously, the heart of Blackwood began to beat again. The scent of decay in the main hall was gradually overpowered by the smell of baking bread from the constantly warm kitchen. The sight of boarded-up windows was countered by the vibrant green shoots emerging in the kitchen garden. The oppressive silence was broken by the clucking of chickens and the occasional indignant bleat from the goat. The 2 maids, seeing their mistress with dirt under her fingernails and flour on her apron, lost their fear and found a new, fierce loyalty. They began to take pride in their work, scrubbing the floors of their small, reclaimed territory until the stone shone, polishing the wooden kitchen table until it glowed with a warm patina. Mrs. Croft, the granite housekeeper, unbent so far as to offer Alara a cup of tea one afternoon, her highest possible endorsement. Alara had arrived at Blackwood as a prisoner in a tomb. 2 years later, she was the undisputed ruler of a small, thriving, self-sufficient kingdom. She had taken a place of death and, through sheer bloody-minded pragmatism, had forced it back to life. She was not a duchess. She was the sovereign of Blackwood, and she had done it all herself. 2 years after he had abandoned his inconvenient wife to the care of damp and decay, Alastair, Duke of Rexmoor, returned to Blackwood Manor. He was not returning in triumph. He was retreating, a wounded animal crawling back to what he hoped was a dark, silent lair. The political world of London, a game he had played with such ruthless mastery, had finally broken him. A coalition he had built had shattered, a trusted ally had betrayed him, and the ghosts of the war, never truly gone, had returned with a vengeance, their whispers filling the quiet moments of the night. He was exhausted. A deep, soul-crushing weariness had settled in his bones, heavier than any physical fatigue. He craved silence. He craved oblivion. He craved the cold, dead peace of the tomb he had purchased for his wife. The thought of her, a fleeting, irritating consideration, crossed his mind. He expected he would be greeted by Mrs. Croft with a black-edged letter and the news that his problem had resolved itself. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a numb, gray emptiness. It was one more death in a life already littered with them. The journey north was a mirror of the one 2 years prior, but this time he was the one staring blankly out the window, seeing nothing. He barely noticed as the landscape changed, his mind a maelstrom of recriminations and remembered failures. He had won the war, but was losing the peace, and the victory felt hollow, the cost too high. He was jolted from his reverie when the carriage, which should have been lurching and sinking into the muddy track to the manor, instead rolled smoothly along a firm, graveled surface. Alastair frowned. He looked out the window. The overgrown, thorny hedgerows that had clawed at the carriage on his last visit were gone, replaced by a neatly trimmed, if severe, boundary. Alastair sat up straighter. Ahead, the gates to the estate, which he remembered as a single, rusted piece of iron hanging from a broken hinge, now stood upright. They were not repaired to their former glory. The Rexmoor crest was still pitted with rust, but they were functional. They were open, waiting. As the carriage passed through them and began the final approach to the house, the wrongness of it all became more pronounced. The wild, tangled forest of weeds had been beaten back from the driveway. The lawn, while not a manicured marvel, had been scythed, the grass short and even. And then he saw the house itself. It was still a gaunt, brooding structure, a testament to long neglect. Most of the windows were still boarded up, giving it the appearance of a blind giant. But it was not the same. The choking shroud of ivy had been cut away from the central section of the house, revealing the dark, clean stone beneath. And from one of the massive chimneys, a chimney in the kitchens, a wing that should have been as dead as the rest, a thick, steady plume of pale gray smoke rose into the crisp autumn air. The sight was so profoundly, fundamentally wrong that Alistair felt a surge of sharp irritation. He had come here for a mausoleum. Someone had been tending the garden. The carriage stopped. The air that greeted him was not just the scent of damp earth and old stone. It was laced with the unmistakable, deeply incongruous smell of wood smoke and something else, something warm and savory, like roasting vegetables. He stepped out, his boots landing on firm, weed-free gravel. He stared at the house. It was not a welcoming sight, but it was no longer a carcass. It was braced. It looked like a fortress, hunkered down for a siege, its vital organs protected, its dead limbs amputated. The front door opened before he reached it. Mrs. Croft stood there. She was as gaunt and severe as he remembered, but her black dress was cleaner, her posture straighter. There was a new, unsettling confidence in her bearing. "Your Grace," she said, her voice even. There was no surprise, no fawning relief at the master's return. It was a simple statement of fact. "Croft," he said, his own voice tight. "What is the meaning of this?" He swept a hand out, indicating the smoke, the cleared grounds. "I gave orders this place was to be left. The Duchess had other ideas," the housekeeper replied, her expression unreadable. The Duchess. The words hit him like a splash of cold water. He had almost forgotten. He had been so certain. "She is alive then," he said. It was not a question. It was an accusation. "Very much so," said Mrs. Croft. Alistair strode past her into the great hall. The air inside was cold, colder than the outside, and smelled of stone and damp. But it was a clean damp, not the putrid scent of mildew he remembered. The floor was swept. The thick layer of dust that had covered everything was gone. The shrouded furniture stood in neat, orderly rows, like an army of ghosts at attention. He saw that the vast, arching doorways to the north and west wings had been sealed with raw, new-looking timber. He followed the faint scent of food and the sliver of light that bled from under a door at the far end of the hall. He had a sudden, vivid memory of his wife, his bride, standing in the rain, a pathetic, shivering creature he had discarded without a second thought. He had expected her to break. He had ordered her to. He pushed open the door. It led not to the kitchens, as he'd expected, but to the library. The room was transformed. The towering shelves were still there, but the books were organized, the floor swept. A fire, a large and healthy one, blazed in the cavernous fireplace, casting a warm, dancing light over the room and chasing away the chill. And in the center of the room, where a dusty table had once stood, was a massive oak desk. It was covered in ledgers, maps, and stacks of paper. And behind it sat a woman. It was her, Ilara, but it was not the woman he remembered. The frail, brittle creature was gone. This woman was still slender, but there was a strength in the line of her shoulders, a confidence set to her head. Her pale skin was no longer translucent. It had a healthy, if faint, glow from the firelight. Her hair was pulled back severely from her face, a practical, no-nonsense style. She wore a dress of dark blue wool, simple and unadorned, but its sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and there was a smear of ink on her cheek. She was not looking at him. Her head was bent, her focus entirely on the ledger spread before her, one long, slim finger tracing a line of figures. She was the absolute, undisputed center of the room. The fire, the desk, the books, they were all part of her domain. She did not look like a duchess. She looked like a general in her campaign tent. Magnificent. The thought was so unexpected, so unwelcome, that he rejected it instantly. This was an interloper, an employee who had overstepped her bounds. He let the silence stretch, expecting her to notice him, to startle, to show some deference. She did not. She reached for a pen, dipped it in an inkwell, and made a sharp, decisive note in the margin of the ledger. Finally, he spoke, his voice harsher than he intended. "You're alive." Without looking up, without a single flicker of surprise, she answered, her voice as cool and clear as a winter morning. "I apologize for the inconvenience. Your Grace," she blotted the ink with a pinch of sand, her movements economical and precise. "If you will excuse me, the quarterly accounts for the timber sales require my full attention." She still had not looked at him. She had dismissed him. Him, the Duke of Rexmoor, the master of the house. He stood there, in the doorway of his own library, a stranger and an intruder in the warm, functioning world she had built from the ashes he had left behind. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly and completely upended. And Alistair, for the first time since the war, had no idea what his next move should be. He was an intruder in his own home. The realization was as galling as it was undeniable. In the days that followed his arrival, Alistair found himself adrift in a world that should have been his, a world that now operated on a set of rules he did not understand, rules that had been written by the ghost he had failed to bury. He tried to assert his authority. It was a disaster. The morning after his arrival, he strode into the kitchens, a vast, stone-flagged domain that now pulsed with warmth and the scent of baking bread. He found Mrs. Croft kneading dough on the great central table. "Croft," he commanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I will be taking my meals in the dining hall. Have it prepared." The dining hall was a monstrous, freezing chamber of rotting tapestries and ghost-white furniture. It hadn't been used in 30 years. Mrs. Croft did not stop kneading. She glanced up at him, her hands dusted with flour. "The dining hall is in the north wing, Your Grace. It has been sealed for 2 years. There is no staff to clean it, no silver to set it, and no one to heat it. We take our meals in here, by the fire." She gestured with her chin toward the smaller table set in an alcove near the hearth. "That is unacceptable," Alistair said, his voice dangerously low. "I'm the Duke of Rexmoor. I will not eat in the kitchens like a servant." The housekeeper paused her work and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression not insolent, but maddeningly practical. "With all due respect, Your Grace, here at Blackwood, we are all servants. Servants to the roof, servants to the winter, and servants to the budget." She then did the most infuriating thing possible. She turned her gaze towards the open door of the library, where Alara sat at her desk, visible from the kitchen. It was a clear, unambiguous gesture. She was looking for confirmation. She was looking at her mistress. Rage, cold and sharp, coiled in Alistair's gut. He was being overruled by a baker and a bookkeeper. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the sound of Mrs. Croft resuming her kneading a quiet, steady dismissal at his back. Everywhere he turned, he was confronted by her presence, by the evidence of her reign. He saw her in the neat stacks of firewood, in the mended slate on the roof, in the small, healthy flock of chickens pecking in a fenced-off yard. He saw the groundsman, Silas, tip his hat to him, but it was Alara he sought out for his daily instructions. The 2 young maids would fall silent and curtsy when he passed, but their easy chatter and laughter returned the moment he was gone, their loyalty clearly belonging to the woman who worked alongside them. He and Alara existed in a state of cold war, circling each other in the reclaimed heart of the manor. They spoke only when necessary, their exchanges clipped and formal. He would find her poring over her ledgers, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a ridiculous urge to sweep them all to the floor, to smash the neat, orderly world she had built. This was his house, his retreat, his place of silence and gloom. She had filled it with the sounds of life and the insult of competence. "You have sold off the Gainsborough portraits," he stated one evening, having discovered the empty, faded squares on the wall of a shrouded corridor. "They were molding," she replied without looking up from her book. "The proceeds paid to have the well cleared and bought enough seed for the spring planting. I felt the ability to drink clean water was a marginally higher priority than contemplating the vacant expressions of your ancestors." Her pragmatism was a weapon, and she wielded it with surgical precision. Every argument he tried to make, every assertion of his traditional authority, was dismantled by her unassailable logic. He was the Duke, the owner, the man of title and power. She was the one who knew how many potatoes they had in the root cellar. In the stark reality of Blackwood, it was brutally clear which of them held the more valuable knowledge. He felt his own identity, the one he had worn like armor for so long, begin to crack. In London, he was Rexmoor, a name that opened doors and silenced opposition. Here, he was just a man. A tall, angry man who kept getting in the way. He was unmoored, his frustration mounting with each passing day. He had come here to be alone with his ghosts, but he found he was not even master of his own haunting ground. The breaking point came, as it so often did with the weather. A storm rolled in from the north, a monster of a thing that threw itself against the stoic walls of the manor. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the boarded-up windows and screaming down the unused chimneys. Rain came in horizontal sheets, drumming against the roof with the relentless, deafening rhythm of cannon fire. Alistair was in the library, staring into the flames, nursing a glass of brandy he had found in a dusty cellar. The first real blast of the storm, a gust of wind that hit the house like a physical blow, made the whole structure groan. The sound, coupled with the percussive drumming of the rain, snagged on something deep inside him. He closed his eyes. The library faded. He was no longer in Northumberland. He was outside by the house, the air thick with gunpowder and the screams of dying men. The rain was not rain. It was the whistle of shot overhead. The groan of the house was the splintering of siege ladders. The fire in the hearth was the burning city, painting the night sky orange and red. His breath hitched. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. The brandy glass slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the stone hearth. The sound lost in a sudden, violent crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the manor. He was gone. The Duke of Rexmoor, the cold, controlled politician, had vanished, and in his place was Captain Gray, the 22-year-old officer who had led his men into a breach of hell and had watched them die, one by one. The ghosts he had come to Blackwood to confront had finally broken their chains. They were all around him, their faces contorted in agony, their silent screams echoing in his mind. He stumbled back from the fire, knocking over a chair. He pressed himself into the corner of the room, behind a towering bookshelf, seeking darkness, seeking cover. He slid down the wall until he was crouched on the floor, his arms wrapped around his head, trying to block out the cacophony of the storm and the war that raged inside him. He was shaking, a tremor that started deep in his soul and worked its way out to his limbs. He was not a duke. He was not a man. He was a terrified boy, trapped in a nightmare from which he could never wake. The library door opened. He flinched at the sliver of light, expecting an enemy, a bayonet, the final, merciful blow. But it was her. Alara stood in the doorway, a single candle in her hand, its flame flickering in the drafts. Her face was pale, her expression concerned. She had heard the crash of the glass. "Your Grace?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. She saw the overturned chair, the shattered glass. She saw the shadows flicker in the corner. Slowly, she walked into the room, her practical, wool-clad form seeming impossibly solid and real in the midst of his phantoms. She rounded the bookshelf and found him. She saw not the arrogant, infuriating Duke who had been tormenting her for days. She saw a man utterly broken. He was crouched like a cornered animal, his broad shoulders shaking, his face hidden. The formidable armor of his title and his cold fury had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, terrifying vulnerability. Her first instinct, a product of years of guarding herself, was to retreat. This was his weakness, a weapon she could use. But the sight of him, so completely undone, stirred something else in her. Not pity. Pity was a useless, condescending emotion. It was recognition. She recognized the look of someone pushed to the absolute brink, the look of a survivor whose defenses have finally, catastrophically failed. She had been there herself, in that cold, damp bed, waiting to die. She did not speak. She did not touch him. She simply blew out her candle and sat down on the floor, a few feet away from him, her back against the opposing bookshelf. She wrapped her arms around her knees and listened to the storm. She did not offer platitudes or comfort. She offered him her presence, a quiet, steady, undemanding anchor in the raging sea of his memory. She grounded him, not with words, but with her own solid reality. She was not a ghost from his past. She was the woman who had mended the roof. She was the woman who knew the storm would pass. She was the woman who had made this place a fortress, strong enough to withstand even this. For a long time, the only sound were the storm outside and the ragged, harsh drawing of his breath. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the violent shaking began to subside. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. He was still lost in the dark, but he was no longer alone there. The quiet, breathing presence in the room with him was a beacon, a single point of reference in the chaos. Hours passed. The storm raged, then blew itself out, its fury replaced by a steady, quiet drumming of rain. Dawn was a long way off, and in the dark, silent library of a house that had been meant as a tomb, a broken duke and his defiant duchess sat on the floor, sharing a crisis that had shattered the walls between them far more effectively than any cannonball. The aftermath of the storm was a world of profound and unnerving quiet. The wind had died, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a land dripping and silent. In the library, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, red light on the two figures who had kept their vigil through the night. Alistair felt hollowed out. The ghosts had retreated, leaving him scoured and raw, the shame of his breakdown a coppery taste in his mouth. He uncurled himself slowly, his muscles stiff and aching. He was still the Duke of Rexmoor, but the title felt like a borrowed coat, ill-fitting and foreign. He looked across the small space at Alara. She was asleep, her head tilted back against the bookshelf, her face pale and weary in the faint light. She looked younger, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. She had stayed. She had seen him at his absolute worst, a quivering, shattered wreck, and she had not fled. She had not mocked him. She had simply stayed. It was an act of unsolicited care so profound and so unexpected that he had no frame of reference for it. He got to his feet, moving quietly so as not to wake her. He looked down at the shattered brandy glass, a testament to his loss of control. He expected her to use this against him, to wield his moment of weakness as the ultimate weapon in their silent war. It was what he would have done. He left the library and walked, not to his own cold, formal chamber, but towards the warmth and light of the kitchens. The house felt different, the silence no longer a hostile presence, but a peaceful one. When he pushed open the kitchen door, he found it empty, the great hearth fire banked but still glowing. On the table, a tray was set for one, with a loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a pot of tea, kept warm by the fire. It was for her, her breakfast, left for whenever she finished her work. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the simple meal. He thought of the endless, formal breakfasts at his London house, served by silent footmen in rooms that echoed with emptiness. He thought of his life, a series of duties, transactions, and battles. In all of it, he could not remember a single instance of someone performing such a simple, unasked-for act of consideration for him. On impulse, he walked to the hearth. He found a kettle, filled it with water from a pump in the corner. In addition, he noted that was new and practical, and set it on a hook over the embers. He found a tin of tea, the same kind that was on her tray. He found another mug. He, the Duke of Rexmoor, a man who had commanded armies and advised kings, stood in the pre-dawn light of his own kitchen and made a pot of tea. The act was so absurd, so far outside the realm of his experience, that it felt strangely grounding. It was a simple, practical task. It was real. He carried 2 steaming mugs back to the library. Alara was awake. She was sitting where he had left her, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary, her defenses immediately clicking back into place. She was bracing herself for his anger, for his denial of what she had witnessed. He said nothing. He walked over, knelt down, and placed one of the mugs in her hands. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into her cold fingers. She stared at the mug, then up at him, her gray eyes wide with confusion. "The east fence came down in the wind," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. It was a test, a return to the practical, the real. Alistair took a sip of his own tea. The hot liquid was bracing. He met her gaze. There was no mockery in his eyes, no anger. Only a deep, echoing exhaustion and something else. Something new. Grudging respect. "I will speak to Silas after I've eaten," he said. It was a truce, an unspoken acknowledgement that the war was over. Later that morning, he found Silas by the ruined fence line, the wind-felled oak lying like a slain giant across the splintered posts. The old groundsman looked up, his expression guarded, expecting a lecture from the Duke on the state of his property. Instead, Alistair took off his fine London coat, folded it neatly over a rock, and rolled up the sleeves of his pristine white shirt. "Show me where we start," he said. For the rest of the day, they worked. Alistair, the haunted Duke, and Silas, the loyal groundsman. They sawed the massive oak into manageable logs. They dug new post holes in the cold, wet mud. It was brutal, punishing work. Alistair's soft, politician's hands were quickly blistered, then torn. His muscles, accustomed to the saddle but not to the axe, screamed in protest. But he did not stop. There was a purity to the labor. The satisfying thud of the axe, the clean scent of splintered wood, the simple, physical reality of the task. It burned away the last of the ghosts. Here, in the mud and the cold, his title meant nothing. His political failures were irrelevant. He was just a man with a strong back, and the fence was broken. It was a problem he could solve with his own two hands. Around midday, Alara appeared, walking across the wet field with a basket over her arm. She brought them bread, cheese, and a flask of hot, sweet tea. She didn't say much. She simply laid out the food on a flat stone, her movements efficient and graceful. She looked at Alistair's torn hands, at the mud streaking his face and clothes, but her expression was unreadable. They ate in a comfortable silence, the three of them. A duchess, a duke, and a groundsman, sharing a simple meal on a cold hillside. The silence was not a weapon anymore. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that something fundamental had changed. That evening, after a bath that felt like a gift from the gods, Alistair found her not in the library, but in the small, warm parlor she had reclaimed. She was at a small table, a single candle illuminating a page of figures. The estate accounts. He pulled up a chair. "Let me see," he said. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pushed the ledger towards him. He had expected a mess, the amateurish scribblings of a desperate woman. What he found was a model of ruthless efficiency. She had tracked every penny, every seed bought, every egg sold. Her notes in the margins were sharp and insightful. She had identified which fields were best left fallow, which tenants were worth keeping, and which assets were a drain. It was a brilliant, pragmatic strategy for survival. But she was out of her depth. She understood the land, the house, the immediate needs. She did not understand the larger picture, the tax laws, the long-term leases, the complex web of external finances that governed an estate this size. "This is wrong," he said, pointing to a column of figures. "You've calculated the land tax based on the old survey. The northern pastures were redesignated as unnarrable 5 years ago. You're paying 3 times what you owe." She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. He could smell the faint, clean scent of soap from her hair and the lingering aroma of rosemary from the kitchens. Her shoulder brushed against his as she examined the page. The contact was brief, accidental, but it was grounding. It was real. "Show me," she said, her voice quiet. And so they began. He brought his knowledge of law and finance, of the world beyond Blackwood's crumbling walls. She brought her intimate, hard-won knowledge of the estate itself, of its soil, its weaknesses, and its strengths. He was the strategist. She was the field commander. Together, they bent over the ledger, their heads close in the small pool of candlelight. He explained the intricacies of entailment. She countered with the reality of a leaking roof. He spoke of leveraging London assets. She pointed out that the goat needed a new tether. They were not a duke and a duchess. They were partners. And in the quiet, shared work, in the comfortable silence that now settled between them, something new and fragile began to take root in the reclaimed soil of Blackwood Manor. The truce solidified into a partnership, as sturdy and unadorned as the stone walls of the manor. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated not by social convention, but by the practical demands of their small, isolated world. Alastair discovered a forgotten aptitude for physical labor, a deep satisfaction in the ache of tired muscles and the tangible results of a mended fence or a cleared ditch. He spent his mornings with Silas, learning the language of the land, a dialect of drainage, soil composition, and the subtle signs of the changing seasons. The work scoured his mind, leaving no room for the ghosts of London or the battlefield. Alara, in turn, found her burden eased. With Alastair handling the complex external accounts and legalities that had been beyond her grasp, she could focus her sharp, practical mind on the internal running of the estate. She planned the spring planting with the precision of a military campaign, organized the household with an efficiency that would have impressed a quartermaster general, and began to experiment with the wild herbs that grew on the hillsides, creating remedies and flavorful additions to their simple meals. They worked separately, but in tandem, a well-oiled machine of two. The true shift occurred in the evenings. After the simple supper they shared with Mrs. Croft and Silas in the warm kitchen, they would retreat to the library. The fire would be roaring, the wind a distant, harmless murmur outside the thick stone walls. They would sit at the great desk, the estate ledgers spread between them, a silent testament to their shared purpose. He would explain a complex point of law, and she would listen, her chin resting on her hand, her lucid gray eyes focused and intelligent. She would point out a flaw in a proposed budget, a practical reality he had overlooked, and he would concede the point with a nod, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He learned that her pragmatism was not a weapon against him, but a tool for their mutual survival. She learned that his aristocratic knowledge was not a mark of superiority, but a resource to be utilized for the good of Blackwood. One evening, while they were reviewing a survey map, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same spot. Neither of them pulled away. For a long moment, his larger, calloused hand rested over her slender, ink-stained one. It was not a romantic gesture. It was an anchor, a simple, physical acknowledgement of their proximity, of the shared space they now inhabited. The air grew thick with an unspoken awareness, a current of energy that had nothing to do with accounts or land management. Slowly, he withdrew his hand, but the warmth of the contact lingered. He started to see her, truly see her. He noticed the way a stray piece of hair would escape her severe bun and curl at her temple. He saw the fierce concentration in her eyes when she was solving a problem, and the rare, fleeting smile that would touch her lips when one of the maids told a joke or when the goat did something particularly obstinate. He realized that her sharp tongue and cynical wit were not her nature, but a shield she had forged to protect a core of profound resilience and a quiet, stubborn hope. She was not the fragile ghost he had abandoned, nor the formidable automaton he had first encountered upon his return. She was a woman of incredible substance and quiet strength. She, in turn, began to see the man beneath the ducal armor. She saw the weariness that still shadowed his eyes, the remnants of a trauma he was slowly learning to live with. She saw the surprising gentleness in his hands when he checked a chicken for a limp, and the dry, understated humor that would occasionally surface in his conversations with Silas. He was not the cold, cruel monster who had banished her. He was a man as broken and scarred as the landscape around them, a man who was, against all odds, learning how to put himself back together. The house itself seemed to breathe easier around them. It was no longer a tomb or a fortress, but something in between. It was a home, a strange, Spartan, unconventional home, but a home nonetheless, built not on love or romance, but on a foundation of mutual respect and shared struggle. The outside world, with its politics and its expectations, had ceased to exist. Their world was bounded by the stone walls of the estate, their calendar marked by the planting and the harvest, their society a small, tight-knit group of 5 disparate souls who had found a common purpose. It was a fragile piece, a delicate ecosystem they had built in isolation, and both of them, without ever speaking of it, knew how precious and vulnerable it was. The intrusion, when it came, was as loud and jarring as a trumpet blast in a library. It was a late afternoon in early spring. A cold, persistent rain was falling, turning the grounds to mud. Alistair and Silas were reinforcing the roof of the small barn, while Alara was in the kitchen teaching one of the maids, a young girl named Bess, how to make a nourishing broth. The atmosphere was one of quiet, productive domesticity. Then came a sound, the thunder of hoofbeats, the jingle of a harness, the shout of a rider. It was a sound that belonged to another world, the world they had forgotten. Alara froze, a ladle of broth halfway to the pot. She looked towards the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a horseman, his cloak spattered with mud, his mount lathered and steaming. He wore the livery of a royal courier. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm, gave a sudden, painful lurch. Her defenses, so carefully lowered over the past months, slammed back into place with the force of a portcullis. The fragile warmth of her new life evaporated, replaced by the familiar, icy chill of anticipated loss. Alistair came in from the rain, his hair plastered to his head, his face grim. He had seen the courier, too. The man dismounted and strode towards him, holding out a leather satchel sealed with the king's own crest. "Your Grace," the courier said, his voice breathless. "An urgent dispatch. From His Majesty. You are summoned to London at once. The coalition has collapsed. Your presence is required." The words hung in the warm, fragrant air of the kitchen, alien and destructive. London, the king, the coalition. They were words from a life Alistair had left behind, a life that had almost destroyed him. Alara watched him. She watched him take the satchel, his expression hardening, the familiar mask of the cold, powerful Duke of Rexmoor settling back over his features. She saw the man she had worked with, the man who had fixed her fences and checked her accounts, disappear, replaced by this formidable, unreadable stranger. He was going to leave. Of course, he was going to leave. He was a duke. His duties, his real life, were in London. Blackwood was just an interlude, a sanatorium for his weary soul. She had been a fool to think it could be anything more. She had been a fool to allow the walls around her heart to crumble. She straightened her spine, her own face becoming a mask of cool, formal indifference. She would not let him see how this gutted her. She would not give him the satisfaction. "Your Grace will need his things packed," she said, her voice perfectly level, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. She turned to Mrs. Croft, who stood frozen by the hearth. "Mrs. Croft, please see to it." The Duke's London attire. She looked back at Alistair, her gray eyes as cold and distant as they had been on the day he returned. "I trust the roads are passable. You will want to leave at first light, I imagine." She had already dismissed him. She was already preparing for his absence. She was retreating back to her role as the Castellan of Blackwood, the solitary queen of her muddy kingdom. She was bracing herself for the silence that was about to descend once more. Alistair stood in the center of the kitchen, the leather dispatch satchel heavy in his hand. The royal seal seemed to burn against his palm, a brand marking him as property of the crown, of the world beyond these stone walls. He heard Alara's words, each one a perfectly formed icicle, rebuilding the wall between them brick by painstaking brick. He saw the retreat in her eyes, the shuddering of the woman he had come to know, replaced by the formal, untouchable Duchess. She was preparing to be abandoned again, and she was making it clear that she would survive it, just as she had before. He looked at her, standing so straight and proud, her face a pale, beautiful mask of indifference. He looked around the kitchen, at the warm, glowing heart of the home she had built. He smelled the savory broth, the wood smoke, the damp wool of his own coat. He heard the quiet, steady ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece, a sound he had come to associate with peace. Then he looked at the dispatch. It represented everything he had fled, the endless, draining game of power, the betrayals, the compromises, the weight of a nation's expectations. It was a summons back to a life that had hollowed him out, a life of gilded cages and profound loneliness. London was not his home. It was his battlefield, and he was tired of war. He thought of the past few months. He thought of the satisfying ache in his shoulders after a day of work. He thought of the comfortable silence in the library, the shared triumph of a balanced ledger, the simple, grounding reality of a mended fence. He thought of the storm and of the quiet, steady presence that had sat with him in the dark. That was real. This dispatch was a phantom from another life. With a sudden, decisive movement, he walked past Alara, past the stunned faces of the household staff, and into the library. He went straight to the fireplace, where the evening fire was already blazing. Alara followed him, her expression a mixture of confusion and wary suspicion. She stood in the doorway, watching him. He did not open the satchel. He did not read the king's command. He looked at the intricate wax seal, the symbol of all his duty and obligation. Then he looked at her, his eyes holding hers across the room, and he dropped the dispatch into the flames. The leather sizzled, curled, and then caught, the king's seal melting like a bloody tear before being consumed by the fire. The parchment within blackened and turned to ash. In a matter of seconds, the urgent summons from the most powerful man in the kingdom was gone. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sheer, treasonous finality of the act was staggering. Alistair turned to face her. The mask of the Duke was gone. His face was open, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "My duties," he said, his voice low and resonant, filling the quiet room, "are here." She stared at him, her mind reeling. Her cynical, practical nature fought to find the angle, the strategy. This was a trick, a momentary madness. "Your duty is to your king," she whispered, the words automatic, the protest of a world she no longer belonged to. "To your title." "My title," he said, a humorless smile touching his lips. "My title is what bought me a tomb and a dying wife. It gave me a house of ghosts and a legacy of neglect." He took a step towards her. "You gave me a home." She shook her head, taking a step back. It was too much, too fast. The hope it ignited was too terrifying to entertain. A home? With leaking roofs and a potato harvest that might fail? Do not be absurd. You are the Duke of Rexmoor. Your world is not here. "You are my world," he said, his voice raw with a truth that stunned them both into silence. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, see the fierce sincerity in his eyes. "Alara, I came back to Blackwood seeking a grave, a quiet place to let the world forget me. Instead, I found you. I found a life, a real 1 inch. He reached out, not to touch her, but gesturing to the room around them, to the house beyond. "This is not a decaying manor. It's the only thing I have ever helped build instead of destroy. My work is not in London. It's here, mending the fences, clearing the fields, and balancing the ledgers. With you." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. With you. It was the one thing she had never, in her wildest dreams, allowed herself to imagine. A partner, an equal, someone who chose to stay. "You cannot just burn a royal dispatch," she stammered, her formidable control finally beginning to crumble. "There will be consequences." "Let them come," he said, his voice fierce. "Let the king send his ministers. Let my rivals scheme. They will find me here. This is my ground. Our ground. I'm not abandoning my post." He finally reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not demanding, not possessive. It was a question, an offering. "Blackwood is my home now, Alara," he said, his voice softening to a near whisper. "But only if you are in it. You're my home." That was it. The final, devastating blow to her defenses. The cynical, guarded, pragmatic survivor who had fought and clawed her way back from the brink was undone by 3 simple words. A single, hot tear escaped her control and traced a path down her cheek. She did not bother to wipe it away. It was a flag of surrender. She sagged against him, the rigid strength that had held her upright for so long finally giving way. Her forehead came to rest against his chest, and she felt his arms come around her, holding her securely, holding her as if he never intended to let go. He was warm and solid, a living, breathing reality against the fear and uncertainty that had been her constant companions. She breathed in the scent of him, rain, wood smoke, and clean earth, the scent of her home. He held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, and for a long time they just stood there in the firelight, two survivors clinging to each other. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a soft, gentle patter against the windows. It was the sound of a coming spring. They were a strange, unlikely pair. The haunted duke who had rejected a kingdom and the pragmatic duchess who had built one from scratch. The world would not understand. Society would be scandalized. But here, in the heart of the house, there was no longer a tomb, but a living, breathing entity. None of that mattered. He had made his declaration. She had accepted his surrender. They stood together, a permanent fixture against the coming seasons, in the house they had reclaimed. Fiercely alive and completely, finally whole.